A curse does not care how much a man loves. It only cares whether he loves enough to pay what freeing its victim actually costs. And most men, when the bill finally comes due, discover they were never quite as brave as their vows suggested. Ravensmere stood at the mouth of the Hollow Vales, a fortress of black stone built by men who had chosen the position for its defensibility, and never once considered how the valley wind, funneling up through the passes at dusk, would sound for the next 300 years, like something grieving just beyond the walls. It was said, in the villages that ringed the duchy, that the Ravensmere line had never known an easy wedding night, that something in the old bargain struck by the first duke had left a shadow over every bride who ever wore the family's betrothal ring. Most dismissed this as the sort of story poor tenants told to explain why the great house on the hill always seemed a little colder than its wealth should allow. Alaric Ravensmere, 8th Duke of Blackmere, had never believed it either, not until his own wedding night proved every story true at once. Alara Fenwick had grown up in the shadow of that same fortress, though from the humbler end of the valley, daughter to a healer woman known through 3 parishes simply as Mother Fenwick, a widow who could set a broken bone, ease a fever, and deliver a breech-born calf with the same unhurried, competent hands. Alara had been raised at her mother's elbow from the time she could walk, learning the valley's plants the way other children learned their letters, which root eased a stomach ailment, which leaf, crushed and bound, drew the poison from a wound, which bark, boiled slow, brought down even the most stubborn fever. She had learned, too, the valley itself, its paths, and its dangers, which streams ran sweet and which ran bitter with old mineral seep, where the ground turned to bog without warning after autumn rain. She had never expected any of it to matter beyond the cottage door. She had certainly never expected a duke. Alaric had first seen her at a village fair, mending a child's torn arm with a calm competence that drew a small, respectful crowd, and had found himself, against every expectation of his rank, unable to look away from the particular stillness with which she worked. No panic, no drama, only quiet, exact attention. He had approached her afterward, once the child had been sent off with a bound arm and a sweet to ease the sting of it, and introduced himself with rather less ceremony than his title generally demanded. "That was well done," he said. "Most physicians I've paid handsomely couldn't manage half that calm over a child screaming the way that one was." Alara had looked up at him, taking in the fine coat and the deference of the crowd around him with a single assessing glance, entirely unimpressed. "Physicians are taught to treat the injury," she said. "My mother taught me to treat the whole frightened child first and the injury second. Panic makes even a simple break harder to set properly." She had wiped her hands on her apron and added, with a directness that startled him more than any flattery could have, "You're the Duke, aren't you? I'd heard you were visiting the fair." "I am. Does that trouble you?" "Should it?" she'd asked, genuinely curious rather than defensive. "I've mended plenty of arms today, belonging to people who'll never sit at your table or dance at your balls. I don't imagine my opinion of a duke changes much of anything for either of us." He had laughed at that, a real laugh, startled out of him, and understood, standing there in the fair's noise and color, that he had never once in his life met anyone quite so entirely unimpressed by everything he'd been raised to believe made him worth impressing. He had courted her plainly, without the usual games of rank and reluctance, and she had accepted him, not for the title, but for the rare thing she saw underneath it, a man who listened when she spoke, and did not flinch when she corrected him. Their courtship, such as it was, had unfolded mostly in the open air of the valley rather than any drawing room. Alaric, riding down from Ravensmere 3 or 4 times a week to walk with her along the streams and hedgerows she knew better than any map, listening as she named every plant they passed and what use it served, watching the particular way her hands moved when she spoke about the work she loved, sure and unhurried, entirely unlike the careful performance of accomplishment he'd grown so weary of in the daughters of neighboring families. He had asked her once, early on, whether she found it strange, a duke walking a healer's daughter along a cow path rather than a garden path. "I find it stranger that most dukes never walk anywhere at all," Alara had said, "when there is so much worth seeing at the pace of actual feet." Mother Fenwick had wept at the betrothal, not as everyone assumed from joy alone, but from a fear she confided to no one, not even her daughter, until the night before the wedding, when she took Alara's hands in the cottage's low firelight and told her, haltingly, the truth of the blood that ran in their family. "There is a debt owed on your line," Mother Fenwick said, her voice thin as the smoke curling up the chimney. "3 generations back, your great-grandmother's grandmother was promised to a Ravensmere duke and cast aside for a richer match on the eve of their wedding. The woman who bore that shame did not simply grieve it. She bound it, a curse laid on her own bloodline as much as his, so that any daughter of that lineage who married into the house of Ravensmere would be taken back by the valley itself on her wedding night, the moment the vow was spoken and sealed, unless a love strong enough to walk into the hollow itself and call her back proved otherwise. She thought, in her grief, that no man alive loved deeply enough to pay so steep a price. She built the curse to prove herself right forever. Alara had sat very still, the way her mother had taught her to sit still before any difficult truth. Why tell me this now, and not before I ever let myself love him? Because I hoped, Mother Fenwick said, that I was wrong to believe the curse still held after so many generations diluted the blood. Because I did not want to be the one who took this happiness from you, before you'd even had the chance to hold it." She had pressed a small cloth bundle into her daughter's hands, dried herbs, a sprig of rue, a plain iron pin, the old protections a healer's daughter grows up trusting more than any priest's blessing. "Wear this against your heart tomorrow. It may do nothing at all, but I could not send you to that altar with empty hands." The wedding was held in the great hall at Ravensmere, all black stone and old tapestries, candlelight throwing long shadows up walls that had watched 3 centuries of Ravensmere brides make the same vows. Alara wore her mother's protective bundle pinned beneath her bodice, close against her heart, and told herself, standing at the altar in her plain ivory gown, that old grief magic 3 generations diluted could not possibly hold the same force it once had. The hall had been full that afternoon in a way it rarely was for Ravensmere occasions. Tenant families crowded near the back, alongside the more fashionable guests from neighboring estates, all of them drawn as much by curiosity over a duke marrying a healer's daughter as by any genuine goodwill, though goodwill, too, had been plentiful enough among those who actually knew Alara. She had looked, walking the length of the hall on no one's arm but her mother's, entirely unlike the nervous, overdressed brides such occasions usually produced. Calm, present, meeting Alaric's eyes across the candlelit distance, with the same steady attention she brought to mending a stranger's child at a village fair. She was wrong. The moment the priest pronounced them wed, and Alaric bent to kiss his bride before the assembled hall, a wind rose from nowhere at all. No window stood open, no door ajar. A cold, keening gust that swept through the great hall and guttered every candle at once, plunging the room into a darkness so total that the gasping crowd could not, in the first confused seconds, agree afterward on what exactly they had seen. Women shrieked. Someone overturned a chair, scrambling backward. One elderly guest, a distant Ravensmere aunt who had attended 4 prior ducal weddings without incident, would later swear she had felt something pass directly through her, cold as a plunge into winter water, in the instant before the candles failed. When light returned, someone striking flint with shaking hands, someone else flinging wide the heavy doors to let in the grey evening, Alaric Ravensmere stood alone at the altar, his bride's ivory gown collapsed empty at his feet, as though she had simply dissolved out of it, her mother's protective bundle lying atop the fabric, unburned, untouched, and utterly useless. The silence that followed was worse in its way than the screaming had been, a long, stunned hush broken only by the priest's own strangled prayer and the soft, terrible sound of Mother Fenwick's single sob, quickly stifled, from the second row. Mother Fenwick, watching from the second row, did not scream or faint as the other guests did. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, to no one, "I had hoped I was wrong." She was not. What followed at Ravensmere, over the 4 years afterward, was a slow, quiet unravelling that the servants spoke of only in low voices and only among themselves. Alaric did not remarry for the first year, consumed with a grief and a bewilderment no physician or priest could properly address. He spent that year in a state the household staff came to recognize and quietly work around. Long hours alone in the study, longer hours riding the valley paths Alara had once shown him, as though retracing her favorite walks might somehow call her back on its own. He consulted physicians from as far as the capital, all of whom examined the empty ivory gown, still kept folded in a locked chest, and offered nothing but confused theories about mass hallucination or elaborate hoax that satisfied no one, least of all the man who had watched his bride dissolve out of that gown with his own eyes. It was pressure from his own solicitor and a distant uncle, both concerned with the succession in the plain, practical way men of business generally were, that finally pushed him toward a second attempt. The Ravensmere line, they reminded him with gentle but persistent regularity, required an heir, and a duke who spent a full year in mourning for a wife lost under circumstances no court or church would recognize as a legitimate marriage at all, was, in the law's cold accounting, still simply an unmarried man, wasting his succession on a story nobody outside Ravensmere's own walls believed. Alaric had resisted the pressure for months, unable to reconcile the practical argument with the sick certainty in his own gut that trying again would only invite fresh disaster. In the end, exhausted by a full year of grief that had produced nothing but worry and worn nerves throughout his household, he allowed himself to be convinced that perhaps the first wedding had simply been some singular, unrepeatable catastrophe, a lightning strike, however devastating, that need not strike twice. When he did remarry, a sensible match to a merchant's daughter named Cecily, arranged more out of duty to the succession than any real desire, the wedding night unfolded exactly as the first had, save for one detail that made it infinitely worse. This time, the gathered household watched Cecily's face and form shift, in the candlelit dark after the vows were sealed, into the unmistakable features of Alara Fenwick, gone 4 years, but somehow present in the room, as though no time had passed at all, before that same cold wind rose and took her, gown collapsing empty just as before. Cecily's own family, horrified and half convinced the Duke himself had somehow engineered the disappearance of their daughter, broke the alliance entirely and refused all further contact with Ravensmere, spreading word through their considerable merchant connections that the house was cursed in truth, not merely in rumor. It happened again with the third bride, a distant cousin's daughter named Rosalind, who had gone into the marriage already half convinced of the danger and had, by her own later account to her family, felt something cold and unwelcome settle over her the moment the vows were spoken, as though she were already being asked to make room in her own body for someone else's grief. She too vanished in the candlelight, and Rosalind's branch of the family never spoke to Alaric again, believing, not unreasonably, that he had known the risk and married her regardless. The fourth attempt was a widow of modest means named Harriet, chosen specifically because she had no immediate family left to grieve or blame him, should the pattern hold, and had married for security rather than love, seeming almost relieved when the curse spared her the marriage entirely. She confided to Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, before quietly departing Ravensmere the following morning with her promised settlement intact, that some part of her had known, from the moment she'd first glimpsed the locked chest holding that folded ivory gown, that this was never a house meant to hold 2 brides at once. By the 5th attempt, a young woman named Margaret, chosen with grim, methodical desperation from a shortening list of families, still willing to risk their daughters on a duke 5 times cursed, and only then, because her own father's debts left the family little real choice in the matter, Alaric no longer pretended, even to himself, that this was misfortune rather than a debt owed. He had watched Margaret's face carefully through their brief, businesslike courtship, and had seen in it not affection, or even simple duty, but a barely concealed fear that told him, more clearly than any of the previous 4 failures had, that he was no longer a man anyone married for hope. He was a man people married out of desperation, the same desperation that had once, in a different generation, bound the original curse in the first place. He stood in the great hall after Margaret's gown, too, collapsed empty at his feet, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after 4 years of denial, that the woman the valley kept taking from every altar was not a stranger's curse working itself out through unlucky brides. It was Ilara. It had always been Ilara. Some part of her, trapped, unfinished, unfreed, was being pulled back into that first vow every single time he tried to complete a different one, as though the valley itself refused to let the marriage be anyone's but hers. By then, the wider duchy had long since begun speaking of Ravensmere in the hushed, half-fearful tones usually reserved for plague houses or battlefields. Neighboring lords who had once courted alliance with the family quietly withdrew their daughters from any consideration, and the capital's more fashionable circles had taken to referring to Alaric, behind carefully raised fans, as the Cursed Duke, a nickname he first heard second-hand from a visiting cousin, and found, to his own surprise, that he could no longer summon the energy to resent, since it was, if anything, considerably kinder than the truth. His fellow peers offered sympathy at social gatherings he increasingly avoided attending, sympathy that carried beneath it a clear and growing unwillingness to risk their own family's fortunes anywhere near his. The steward's ledgers, meanwhile, showed the duchy's finances slowly fraying at the edges regardless of the curse, tenant confidence shaken by a lord who seemed, in the village's own whispered assessment, to be one bad harvest away from losing his mind entirely to grief. Alaric had watched all of it happen with the same distant, exhausted awareness he brought to everything in those years, understanding only dimly, until Mother Fenwick finally spoke the plain truth to him, that the whole of his life had quietly narrowed down to a single unanswered question he had spent 4 years too frightened to properly ask. He sent Margaret home with a full dowry and his sincerest, most exhausted apology, and rode, that same night, down into the village to find Mother Fenwick. Mother Fenwick had aged a decade in the 4 years since the wedding, her hair gone fully grey, her hands, once so steady with needle and poultice, beginning to show the faint tremor of grief, carried too long without rest. She opened her cottage door to find the Duke of Blackmere standing in the rain, hat in hand, and did not look surprised at all. "You've finally come to ask," she said, not a question, and stepped aside to let him in. She sat him by the fire and told him what she had spent 4 years hoping she would never have to say aloud, that the curse, old as it was, still held a single narrow door of mercy within it, the way most grief magic did, because even the woman who'd bound it could not bring herself to make the punishment entirely without hope. Ilara's soul was not destroyed. It was held, caught in the place the old magic called the Hollow, deep within the weeping stones at the heart of the Vales, a standing circle so old no living person could say who had raised it or why. A soul held there could be called back, Mother Fenwick said, but only by a love willing to pay the price the curse itself demanded, the suitor's entire worldly fortune, given away before the journey began, so that he arrived at the stones with nothing left to offer his lost bride but himself. "Why the fortune?" Alaric asked. "What use has old grief magic for a man's gold?" "None whatsoever," Mother Fenwick said. "That is rather the point. The woman who bound this curse did not want a rich man's gold. She wanted proof that a Ravensmere duke could love something more than the wealth and comfort his name had always bought him without question. Gold is easy to give away when a man expects to buy back happiness with it. She wanted to know whether any of your blood would give it away with nothing at all, guaranteed in return." "How do you know all this?" Alaric pressed, leaning forward. You spoke of it as legend the night before the wedding. You speak of it now as though you've read the very terms of the bargain yourself. Mother Fenwick was quiet a moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Because my own mother told me, and hers told her, and so it has passed down our line alongside the curse itself, generation to generation, in case any daughter of ours should ever find herself standing at a Ravensmere altar again. We are not merely victims of this old grief, Your Grace. We are its keepers, whether we wished for the inheritance or not. I know the terms because forgetting them was never permitted to any Fenwick woman, however much I might have wished, these 4 years, that I could simply forget and grieve my daughter plainly instead. Has any man succeeded before? Alaric asked. In 3 generations, has the door of mercy you speak of ever actually opened for anyone? Mother Fenwick's face, already lined with years of carried grief, seemed to age further still with the honesty of her answer. Once, that the family stories record. My own grandmother's sister was taken the same way, on her own wedding night, to a lesser lord 2 valleys over. He went after her, gave up considerably less than a duchy, since he had considerably less to give, but gave up the whole of it regardless. The stories say he called for 11 days before the valley returned her to him. I tell you this not to promise you 11 days will suffice, Your Grace, but so that you understand plainly. It has happened before. It is not merely a fable told to comfort dying hope. It is a debt that has been paid successfully at least once, and I see no reason love itself has grown weaker in the generations since. Alaric sat with that a long moment, the fire popping softly in the grate. And if I go, and give up everything, and still cannot call her back, then you will have given away a duchy for nothing, Mother Fenwick said plainly, and I will have watched my daughter's soul remain lost in that valley regardless, and both of us will have to live the rest of our lives with that particular grief. I will not pretend to you that the odds favor success, Your Grace. I will only tell you that they favor it a great deal more than doing nothing has, these past 4 years. Alaric rose and bowed to her with a formality that felt, in that low cottage room, almost out of place, and entirely sincere regardless. Then I will go, he said, whatever it costs, and however many days it takes. I have spent 4 years failing your daughter through cowardice and false hope both. I will not fail her now through simple unwillingness to pay what the debt actually demands. Alaric Ravensmere sold Blackmere's estates within the month, the tenant farms first, transferred to their own farmers at fair prices, rather than to any grasping neighbor lord who might have exploited the sudden sale. The townhouse in the capital, the silver and the jewels that had passed down 8 generations of dukes. Finally, the great house itself, sold to a wealthy wool merchant who agreed, at Alaric's particular insistence, to keep on every servant who wished to stay, rather than turn them out. He kept only the clothes on his back, a sturdy horse, and enough coin, carefully calculated, to see him fed on the road to the Vales, and not a shilling more. The solicitor tasked with drawing up the sale papers had questioned him twice, gently, on whether he wished to reconsider. A duchy given away in its entirety, the man pointed out, could not simply be reclaimed should the venture fail, and there were, surely, more modest ways to fund even so extraordinary a journey as the one his Grace proposed. Alaric had listened to the full argument each time with patient courtesy, and given the same answer both times, that Mother Fenwick's counsel had been explicit on the point, and that he had already spent 4 years attempting the modest, reasonable, half-committed version of devotion, to no result whatsoever beyond 4 ruined marriages and a wife still lost. He would not insult whatever mercy the valley held by arriving with anything less than everything. The household staff, who might reasonably have resented a master who'd just sold the roof over their heads for a dead woman's ghost, instead, lined the drive to see him off, and old Pell, who had served 3 generations of Ravensmere butlers before him, pressed a small flask of brandy into his hand at the gate, and said only, "Bring her home, Your Grace, whatever that costs." This house was never right without her, not for 1 single day since. The Hollow Vales were 3 weeks hard riding from Ravensmere, through country that grew progressively wilder, and less hospitable the deeper Alaric travelled. First rolling farmland, giving way to rocky moor. Then moor, giving way to a series of steep, narrow valleys, the local shepherds called, with the plain dread of people who lived close enough to old magic to respect it without needing to understand it, simply the Vales, and would say nothing further about beyond warning him not to camp near standing stones after dark. The first week of travel tested him in ways his years of comfortable ducal living had left him wholly unprepared for. He had ridden often enough on his own lands, but never for a full week's continuous distance, with his provisions strictly rationed against a journey whose length he could not properly predict. He slept in hedgerows, and beneath the meagre shelter of dry stone walls, woke stiff and cold more mornings than not, and found, somewhere around the 5th day, that the simple physical discomfort of the road was already beginning to strip away the last vestiges of the man who had once measured hardship by a delayed dinner or an uncomfortable carriage seat. He welcomed the change, oddly, finding in the daily grind of the journey a kind of penance that felt, for the first time in 4 years, like it was actually accomplishing something, rather than simply being endured. On the 16th day, in the last village before the true wilderness began, he stopped to water his horse, and was approached by an old shepherd who studied his fine, if travel-worn coat, and his gaunt, purposeful face, with the particular knowing look of a man who had seen others pass through on similar errands, and not all of them return. "You're bound for the Weeping Stones," the shepherd said. It was not a question. "I am. Third one this decade I've seen ride through with that look about him," the old man said, shaking his head slowly. "Grief, wearing a man's face like a coat 2 sizes too large. The other 2 never came back through this village again, Your Grace. And I'll not pretend I know whether that means they succeeded and settled elsewhere, or whether the Vales simply kept them." He studied Alaric a moment longer, then added, with what seemed like genuine reluctant kindness, "Whatever you're calling back, sir, call it like you mean it, every single time, even the 100th time, even when your own voice stops believing the words. The stones test patience more than devotion, in my grandmother's telling of it. They want to know if a man's love outlasts his hope, since hope is the easier thing to keep, and any fool can love someone while he still believes he'll win her back." Alaric thanked him, uncertain whether the words offered comfort or simply a heavier weight to carry the rest of the way, and rode on into the wilderness the following morning. He found the Weeping Stones on the 19th day of travel, in the deepest of the valleys, a ring of ancient grey monoliths, standing in a shallow bowl of land where the wind, funneling down from the surrounding peaks, made a low, continuous moan that gave the place its name, a sound that might, on an unkind night, be mistaken for a woman weeping just beyond the edge of hearing. The valley floor around the stones was strange, barren ground, the grass grown thin and colourless in a wide circle that stretched perhaps 30 yards beyond the monoliths themselves, as though the earth there had forgotten, generations ago, how to properly grow anything. No birds crossed the bowl of the valley, not even at a distance. No rabbit or fox tracks marked the pale, close-cropped turf. The stones themselves were taller than any man, streaked grey-green with lichen so old it had worn smooth in places. Standing in a rough circle wide enough to hold perhaps 40 people, though Alaric, arriving alone at dusk, found the space felt considerably larger and considerably colder than its measured dimensions suggested it should. He tethered his exhausted horse at the edge of the barren ground, where at least a little grass remained for it to graze, and walked the rest of the way into the circle on foot, his own footsteps oddly muffled against the strange, thin turf. He stood at the edge of the circle at dusk on the 19th day, exhausted, wind-scoured, half-starved from 3 weeks of careful rationing, and did the only thing Mother Fenwick's instructions had left him to do. He called her name. Elara. The wind answered with nothing but its own low moan. He called again. And again, through that first night and into the grey dawn of the 20th day, he called her name into the standing stones, until his voice cracked and failed him entirely, and nothing in the valley answered but wind and silence, and once, distantly, the lonely cry of some night bird that made his heart leap uselessly, before subsiding again into disappointment. He did not leave. He had nowhere left to go, no house, no fortune, no life beyond this valley and this single narrow hope. So he simply began again, on the 20th day, calling her name at dawn and at dusk, and through the long grey hours between, sleeping in brief exhausted snatches against the base of the largest stone, eating the last of his provisions down to nothing, and then simply going without, because Mother Fenwick had not told him what a man was meant to eat once his gold and his supplies both ran out, and he had not thought, setting out, that the journey might demand quite this much of him beyond the initial sacrifice. By the 10th attempt, the 10th full day of calling, voice raw, body failing, despair began to creep in around the edges of his resolve, in a way he had not expected, or had expected, and simply refused to plan for. He sat with his back against the cold stone on the evening of that 10th day, and allowed himself, for the first time since selling the last of his silver, to genuinely consider that Mother Fenwick might have been wrong, that the narrow door of mercy she'd described might have closed generations ago, worn shut by time, the way any door left long unused eventually seizes on its hinges, and that he had given away an entire duchy to sit alone in a valley calling a dead woman's name, until he, too, simply died there, unremembered, the 9th and final Duke of a line that ended not in battle or scandal, but in a wind-scoured valley nobody would ever think to search. He thought, that night, of riding back, of admitting defeat, of finding some small cottage somewhere, and living out whatever remained of his life, in the quiet, penniless obscurity he'd earned through his own foolishness. He thought of it seriously, turning the idea over, the way a man turns over any temptation to simply stop suffering. He remembered, too, the old shepherd's words from the last village. They want to know if a man's love outlasts his hope, since hope is the easier thing to keep, and understood, sitting there in the deepening cold, with his hope nearly spent, that this was precisely the test the shepherd had warned him of, arriving exactly on schedule. He no longer believed, with any real conviction, that his 20th call would succeed where his 9th had failed. He found, examining that hopelessness honestly, that he intended to call her name again anyway, not because he expected it to work, but because stopping felt, in that moment, like a second and far worse betrayal than any 4 years of failed remarriages had been. A betrayal not of hope, which he had already largely surrendered, but of love itself, which he discovered, turning it over in the dark, he was not yet willing to surrender alongside it. And then he thought of Ilara's face at the village fair, calm and exact over a child's torn arm, and the particular way she had looked at him across 4 years of courtship, as though his title were the least interesting thing about him she'd ever bothered to notice. And he found, examining his own exhausted despair honestly, that he did not actually want the relief of quitting nearly as much as he wanted her back, whatever the valley still demanded of him to earn it. He called her name again at dawn on the 11th day, and the 12th, and the 15th, when his voice had worn down to little more than a raw whisper, and his body had grown gaunt enough that his own coat hung loose, across shoulders that had once filled it easily. Twice, in those middle days, he collapsed entirely against the stone, and simply lay there through the worst of the cold, too spent to call anything at all, only to wake at first light and begin again, because stopping, he had discovered somewhere around the 15th day, had become a harder thing to choose than continuing. On the 17th attempt, delirious with hunger and cold, he found himself no longer simply calling her name, but speaking to her directly, as though she could already hear him across whatever distance still separated them, recounting, in a cracked and wandering voice, the particular walk along the hedgerow stream where he'd first told her he loved her, the exact words she'd used to correct his clumsy attempt at identifying a specific wildflower, the sound of her laugh on the one occasion he'd managed to genuinely surprise her. "I remember the fair," he told the empty circle of stones, voice breaking on nearly every word. "I remember you told me my opinion of you mattered a great deal less than you'd have expected. And I remember thinking, I had never in my life wanted anyone's good opinion so badly as I wanted yours, from that very moment. I remember our wedding morning, before the wind came, you laughing at something Mother Fenwick said, entirely unafraid, entirely happy, for one whole morning before the valley took that happiness away from both of us. I have spent 4 years married to the memory of that single morning, more faithfully than I ever managed to be married to anyone standing in front of me instead. That is not devotion I am proud of, Ilara. It is simply the truth, and I owe you the truth, even if these stones swallow every word of it and give me nothing back in return. He was not entirely certain, afterward, whether this had been strategy or simple madness. He suspected, examining it later with a clearer head, that it had been both at once, and that the valley had perhaps wanted exactly that, not merely her name shouted into the wind, but the whole accumulated weight of everything he actually remembered and loved about her, offered without reservation, without the polished performance a duke's public grief usually demanded, only the raw and unflattering truth of a man who had failed her repeatedly, and knew it. On the 18th of his attempts, the 37th day since leaving Ravensmere entirely, he thought, for one impossible half-second at dusk, that the wind's low moan had shaped itself into something almost like his own name in return. He told himself it was exhaustion working tricks on a starving mind, and called again anyway, because he had nothing left to lose by trying, regardless of what he believed. By the 19th attempt, his body had reached a state he would later struggle to properly describe to anyone who had not lived through similar deprivation, beyond hunger, beyond even the dull, persistent ache that had characterized the first 2 weeks, into a strange, hollowed-out clarity where his own physical suffering seemed to matter less than it should have, as though his mind had begun quietly separating itself from a body it could no longer trust to survive much longer, regardless of the outcome. His hands, when he examined them in the grey dawn light, shook constantly now, whether from cold or weakness or simple nervous exhaustion, he could no longer say. He had stopped, several days back, being able to stand fully upright, without the world tilting alarmingly around him, and had taken to calling her name from where he knelt against the largest stone, unable to trust his own legs for anything beyond the shortest necessary movements. He thought, kneeling there on the morning of the 19th attempt, watching his own breath cloud faintly in the cold air, that he did not know with any certainty whether he would survive a 20th day of this, regardless of whether it succeeded, that his body's reserves, stretched thin across 19 days of starvation, layered atop 3 weeks of already careful rationing, might simply fail entirely before the valley ever answered him at all. He called her name anyway, voice a bare thread of sound by that point, and told himself, as he had told himself every morning since the 10th day, that stopping was no longer a choice his heart would permit him to make, whatever his failing body might argue otherwise. On the 20th attempt, at dawn, with the sky just beginning to grey, at the eastern rim of the valley, Alaric Ravensmere called Ilara's name one final time, with what felt like the very last reserve of voice and will his ravaged body had left to give, and the wind, for the first time in 20 days, went suddenly, completely, unnervingly still. In the sudden, total silence, a shape began to gather at the center of the standing stones. Not smoke exactly, nor mist, but something with the quality of both, pale and slowly thickening in the grey dawn light, until it took, unmistakably, the form of a woman standing where no woman had stood a moment before. Ilara Fenwick looked exactly as she had on her wedding day, ivory gown and all, save that her eyes, when they opened and found him, carried 4 years of a grief and a waiting he could not begin to fully imagine, however much he had spent those same 4 years grieving her in turn. Alaric, her voice, when it came, was thin as the wind that had carried it, but it was hers, unmistakably, achingly hers. He did not trust himself to stand. He had spent 20 days calling her name with the last of his strength, and now that she stood before him, real and present, and looking at him with an expression that held equal parts wonder and disbelief, he found the whole enormous weight of it, the fortune given away, the weeks of hunger, the nights of despair, arrived all at once, and his legs, already failing, simply would not hold him any longer. "You came," Elara said, crossing the small distance between them and sinking to her knees beside him as his vision began to grey at the edges. "You actually came, and you kept calling, even when—" She stopped, taking in properly, for the first time, the full gauntness of him, the cracked lips, the hollow eyes of a man who had starved himself nearly to death for the chance to say her name into an empty valley 20 separate times. "Oh, Alaric, what have you done to yourself?" "Whatever it cost," he managed. "It cost less than losing you did." "4 marriages," Elara said, her hand coming up to touch his face, with a tenderness that made him understand, even in his failing state, that she had watched every single one of them from wherever she had been held, powerless to stop it, forced to inhabit each vanishing bride's final moment before being pulled back into the stones. "I watched all 4, Alaric. I could not stop myself from being pulled into it, could not warn you, could not do anything at all but watch you try again and again to replace something the valley would never let you replace. I feared, toward the end, that you had simply stopped believing it was me at all, that you'd convinced yourself it was only a curse, working itself out through unlucky strangers, and that eventually you would simply stop trying entirely. I nearly did," he admitted, the honesty costing him what little strength he had left to spare. "Margaret was meant to be the last attempt at an ordinary solution. I came here instead because Mother Fenwick finally told me the truth, and because I could not live one more year telling myself a lie about grief and unlucky strangers, when some part of me had always known, from the very first collapsed gown, that it was you. And then you called for 20 days, Elara said, starving, alone, with nothing left to your name. 19 days of doubting whether it would work at all, he said, and one final call I made only because stopping had become harder than continuing. And then the grey at the edges of his vision closed in entirely, and he knew nothing more. He woke to the sound of water and the particular smell of wood smoke and crushed herbs that he would, for the rest of his life, associate more strongly with safety than any other scent in the world. He was lying on a bed of dried bracken inside a shallow cave, a fire built small and careful near the entrance, a rough blanket, his own coat, he realized, spread over him, tucked close against the chill. Elara knelt beside the fire, her ivory wedding gown now practically stripped for practicality, the skirts torn away at the knee, sleeves pushed back, tending something in a small dented pot that smelled, faintly, of the same herbs her mother had once bundled against her heart on their wedding day. "You're awake," she said, not turning from the pot, though he could hear the relief threaded through her carefully even voice. "Good. You've been unconscious the better part of a day. I found this cave a half-mile from the stones. You were in no state to travel further, and I was not about to lose you to exhaustion after everything it cost to get you back." "You found water," he said, throat still raw, taking in properly for the first time the makeshift camp she had assembled, the fire, the pot, a small collection of foraged roots and greens, laid out on a flat stone. "You hunted." "My mother did not raise a healer's daughter who forgets her craft, simply because she spent 4 years as a ghost in a standing circle," Elara said, and there was, beneath the exhaustion in her own voice, the faint, dry ghost of the humor he remembered loving in her. "There's a stream a 1/4 mile below the cave mouth, and I set a snare last evening. Nothing grand, a hare, but enough broth to see you strong enough to travel again in a few days' time. Drink this." She brought the small pot to him, helping him sit enough to manage it, her hand steady against his shoulder, the way it had once been steady over a child's torn arm at a village fair. "Slowly, your body has forgotten how to properly hold food after 20 days without it." He drank, slow and careful as instructed, watching her over the rim of the cup with an expression she seemed determined not to acknowledge directly, though the faint color that rose in her hollowed cheeks suggested she felt the weight of it regardless. "How did you know how to find your way here?" he asked, once the broth had steadied him enough to manage a longer question. You were mist and stone a day ago. How does a soul freshly returned to flesh know a mountain stream from a mile off? I don't entirely know myself, Alara admitted, settling back on her heels. Some part of what the valley held was not merely my body waiting to be reclaimed, I think, but everything I knew and was, kept whole rather than scattered, my mother's craft included. I woke in flesh already remembering exactly how to set a snare and which roots along that hillside were safe to eat, the same as I'd have known it the morning before my wedding. Perhaps that was its own small mercy, buried inside the larger cruelty. I was not returned to you as an empty vessel needing to relearn everything from nothing. I was returned as myself, complete, only hungrier, and considerably more travel-worn than I'd have liked. What was it like? He asked carefully, being held there. 4 years is a long time to be mist and stone. Alara was quiet a long moment, staring into the small fire before she answered. It was not sleep, and it was not waking, exactly. I was aware, in some fashion, aware of the wind, aware of the seasons turning around the stones, aware, worst of all, of being pulled forward whenever a new bride spoke her vows to you, as though the valley wanted me to witness each attempt personally before drawing me back into the quiet again. I could not speak in those moments, could not warn Cecily, or Rosalind, or Harriet, or Margaret of what was coming, could only watch it happen through eyes that felt, each time, less and less like my own, the longer I was held there. I began to fear, somewhere around the third bride, that I was losing the shape of myself entirely, that eventually I would simply become the wind the shepherds speak of, with no memory left of ever having been a woman who mended a child's arm at a village fair. And yet you remembered, Alaric said quietly. Every plant, every skill. You remembered me. I remembered you most of all, Alara said, meeting his eyes across the small fire. I think, if I am honest, that was the one thing the valley could never quite take from me. However much of the rest, it wore away at the edges. Every time I was pulled forward to watch you try again, I held on to the memory of the village fair, of our walks along the hedgerow, of the particular way you used to mispronounce the names of half the herbs I taught you, no matter how many times I corrected you. It was not hope exactly. By the fourth bride, I had very nearly given that up. It was simply memory, refusing to let go, even after hope itself had worn through. I am sorry, Alaric said, the words feeling wholly inadequate against 4 years of exactly that. I am sorry it took me so long, and 3 ruined marriages, and Mother Fenwick, finally forcing the truth on me directly, to come here at all. You came, Alara said simply. In the end, that is the only part of it I intend to keep dwelling on. I have nothing left to offer you, he said finally, when the broth was gone, and his voice had steadied enough to manage more than single words. No house, no fortune, not even proper clothes to my name beyond what I'm wearing. I gave away an entire duchy on the strength of a healer's promise that love might prove stronger than 100-year-old grief, and I have no earthly notion what either of us is meant to live on now that it's actually worked. We are meant to live on exactly what we're living on right now, Alara said, settling back beside the fire with the particular calm competence he had fallen in love with at that village fair 4 years and a lifetime ago. A cave, a snare line, a stream, and each other. I spent 4 years trapped in stone, Alaric, watching from somewhere I could not properly explain even to myself, as you married 3 women, who were never me, and buried 3 more empty wedding gowns in a family plot that should have belonged to me. I do not particularly care, tonight, that you no longer own a duchy. I care a great deal more that you're alive, and that I'm not made of mist any longer, and that we have a fire and a full belly of broth between us. The rest, we will manage the way anyone manages anything, one day and then the next one. They stayed in the cave 2 full days before Alara judged him strong enough to travel, during which time the balance of care between them shifted, slowly, from entirely her burden to something closer to shared. On the first day, she hunted and foraged and tended the fire alone, while he slept the deep, dreamless sleep of genuine exhaustion. By the second, he was strong enough to help gather deadfall for the fire, to skin the second hare her snare had caught, to sit up through the evening and simply talk with her. 4 years of separate grief compressed into 2 days of careful, unhurried conversation, each of them learning the shape of what the other had survived. They set out on the 3rd day, moving slowly, Alaric's strength returning by degrees, but still far from what it had been before 20 days of starvation. It was on the 5th day of the journey home, crossing a particularly steep and exposed stretch of moor, that Alara's own strength finally failed her. The accumulated toll of 4 bodiless years, followed immediately by 2 days of hunting and tending a starving man back from the edge of death, finally demanding its own reckoning. She stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again, and Alaric, who had spent the previous 2 days learning again how to walk under his own power, caught her before she went down entirely. "I have you," he said, and meant it in every sense the words could carry. He gathered her up properly then, carrying her the way she had, in effect, carried him through those first desperate hours in the cave, finding them shelter beneath a rocky overhang when the afternoon turned to rain, building what fire the damp wood would allow, foraging clumsily but earnestly for whatever edible roots he could remember her pointing out to him over the past several days, boiling water with hands that shook from the unfamiliar effort but did not stop trying. "You're a terrible cook," Alara told him weakly. The first evening he attempted to replicate her broth unassisted, managing something between amusement and genuine gratitude in her exhausted voice. "Truly dreadful. I believe you've somehow made plain water taste of ash." "I am learning," Alaric said, entirely unoffended, pressing the cup into her hands regardless. "You had 4 years alone in that valley to remember how to survive on nothing. Grant me at least a few days to learn the same, and I promise you the broth will improve considerably before we reach home." It did, by small degrees, over the following days. On the 8th day, caught in an unexpected early frost that neither of them had properly equipped for, Alaric spent a long, difficult night keeping the fire fed by hand rather than sleeping, determined that Alara, still weak, should have the whole of the coat and blanket, both while he made do with what warmth the flames could offer directly. She woke before dawn to find him awake still, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, and said nothing about it beyond quietly moving to sit beside him, sharing what warmth she could offer in turn, until the sun finally rose and the worst of the cold passed. "You did not need to stay awake the whole night on my account," she told him, once the fire had burned down to embers and the frost had begun to lift. "I have spent 4 years failing to protect you in every way a man can fail," Alaric said. "I intend to spend considerably more care than one sleepless night making up for it, starting now and continuing for as long as you'll allow me the privilege." And more importantly, Alara's strength returned steadily as the days went on, Alaric carrying her when the ground grew too steep or her legs too unsteady, Alara guiding him, even in her weakened state, through terrain and plant lore he would have blundered past entirely alone. It was, Alaric found himself thinking more than once on that slow journey home, a strange and entirely unlooked-for gift buried inside an otherwise devastating ordeal, that the valley had, in taking everything from him, given him back a wife who was not merely rescued, but who had, in her own turn, rescued him first, so that neither of them ever again had cause to wonder which one owed the other the greater debt. They reached the outskirts of the old Blackmere lands 3 weeks after leaving the Weeping Stones, thin, sun-browned, dressed in little better than rags, and were recognized, in the end, not by the wool merchant who now owned the great house, but by old Pell, the former butler, who happened to be walking the lane on some errand of his own, and stopped dead at the sight of a man he'd thought never to see alive again, walking beside a woman everyone in the valley had assumed dead these 4 years past. Pell did not manage a single coherent word for a long moment, simply staring, his weathered face working through disbelief towards something closer to joy, before he finally crossed the lane at something between a walk and a run and embraced his former master with an informality 30 years of proper service had never once permitted him, murmuring, "I told you, Your Grace. I told you this house was never right without her." He turned to Alara then, and bowed as deeply and formally as if she still wore a duchess's gown, rather than the torn, travel-worn remains of her wedding dress. "Your Grace, welcome home." Word travelled through the old tenant lands faster than any messenger could have carried it. By evening, half the former household had gathered at the small cottage the wool merchant, moved by the story, and by no small sense that some things simply were not his to keep, offered the returning couple as a temporary lodging, the very cottage, as it happened, where Mother Fenwick had once lived, though she herself had passed quietly in her sleep some 8 months into her daughter's absence, never learning whether her counsel had ultimately saved her daughter, or simply sent a good man to die uselessly in a cursed valley. Alara wept properly for the first time since her return, that first night in her mother's old cottage, grieving a woman who had spent her final months not knowing whether her own counsel had been salvation or folly, and Alaric held her through it without a single word, understanding that some griefs asked only to be witnessed rather than solved. Alaric and Alara were married again within the month, in the small village chapel, rather than the great hall of a house neither of them owned any longer, in a ceremony attended by tenant farmers and former servants, rather than lords and ladies, Alara in a plain grey wool dress, rather than any grand gown, Alaric in the same worn coat he'd worn across 3 weeks of valley and moor. There was no great feast afterward, no dancing beneath crystal chandeliers, only a simple supper laid out on trestle tables, borrowed from the village hall, tenant families bringing what dishes they could spare, old Pell insisting on pouring the wine himself, despite no longer being employed to do so by anyone. When the priest pronounced them wed and Alaric bent to kiss his bride, the household gathered outside the chapel held its collective breath, half expecting, even now, the old cold wind to rise and take her again. It did not come. The evening stayed still and warm, ordinary as any evening anywhere, and Alaric Ravensmere remained entirely, solidly, permanently present through the whole of that night and every night that followed. They did not reclaim the duchy. The wool merchant, learning the full truth of the sacrifice that had emptied the great house, offered more than once to sell it back at whatever price they could manage, but Alaric declined each time, telling him plainly that a house bought back with borrowed money was not the same thing as a house given away freely, and that he had learned, in a cave in the Hollow Vales, that he needed considerably less than a duchy to be genuinely happy. They settled instead in a modest farmhouse on what had once been Ravensmere land, Alara resuming, in time, something very like her mother's old healing practice among the valley's tenant families. Alaric learning slowly, patiently, under his wife's occasionally exasperated tutelage, to be genuinely useful with his hands, rather than merely decorative with his title. The tenants, who had watched 3 generations of Ravensmere dukes ride past their cottages with barely a nod of acknowledgement, found themselves, in the years that followed, growing genuinely fond of the strange, humbled former duke, who now split his own firewood, and had, by his own cheerful admission, still not entirely mastered the art of a proper broth. He took work where it was offered, mending fences, helping bring in harvests, once even apprenticing himself for a full season to the valley's aging blacksmith, who declared him hopeless with a hammer, but appreciated the effort regardless. Alara's healing practice grew steadily, tenant families walking considerable distances for her particular skill, with fevers and difficult births, and more than one grateful mother, cradling a newly delivered infant, told her privately that the valley had never quite recovered from losing her the first time, and seemed, now, determined to make up for those 4 empty years all at once. The old shepherd from the last village before the wilderness found his way to their door one autumn, 2 years after the wedding, having heard through the slow, winding gossip of travelling drovers that the duke who'd ridden through with grief, wearing his face like a coat 2 sizes too large, had, against all the shepherd's own cautious expectations, actually returned. He stayed a single night, ate a proper meal at their table, and left the following morning with a small sack of Alara's dried herbs pressed into his hands against his own aging joints, telling them both, at the gate, that he intended to tell the story rather differently to the next grief-stricken traveler who passed through asking after the weeping stones. "I'll tell them it can be done," he said. "I never had proof of that before, only my grandmother's old telling of it. Now I've sat at the table of a man who proved it himself, and that's a different thing entirely to carry forward." On quiet evenings, when the wind rose over the valley the way it always had, carrying that same low moan down from the Hollow Vales in the distance, Ilara would sometimes go still and listen to it for a long moment before returning to whatever task occupied her hands. "Do you still hear her in it?" Alaric asked once, watching her listen. "The woman who cursed us." "I hear the wind," Ilara said. "That's all it ever was, in the end. Grief given a shape it could live inside for a while, the same as any grief does, until someone finally proves it wrong." She reached for his hand, work roughened now to match her own, and threaded her fingers through his, the way she had every evening since the chapel. No cold wind between them, no vanishing left to fear. "It doesn't frighten me any longer. I know now exactly how the story ends." Years later, when their own daughter asked them, as children eventually always do, why the wind sometimes seemed to moan so strangely down from the vales on quiet evenings, Ilara would tell her the whole story plainly, the way her own mother had once told it to her, not as a warning to be feared, but as a lesson in what grief could become if it was never allowed to heal, and what it took, in the end, to finally answer it. She would tell her, too, that the original woman who bound the curse 3 generations back had never intended it as pure cruelty, whatever pain it caused along the way. That grief, given no outlet at all, will eventually reach for any shape it can find to make itself heard, and that the kindest thing anyone could do for an old wound, human or magical alike, was to finally, fully answer it, rather than simply enduring its ache in silence. Whether the curse's origin had ever truly rested, no one could say for certain, but the wind over Ravensmere, in all the years that followed, never again took a bride from any altar, and the valley's shepherds, in time, stopped warning travelers away from the weeping stones altogether, telling them instead, if they asked, the story of the Duke who gave up everything and got it all back tenfold. Thank you for listening to this story of Ravensmere, of a curse that demanded everything a man had, and a love that found it was, in the end, more than enough to pay the price. If you found yourself holding your breath through those 20 days in the weeping stones, or hoping against hope that Alaric's voice would hold out one call longer than his despair, please give this video a like, share it with anyone who believes some loves are worth losing everything for, and subscribe for more historical fantasy romances of curses, sacrifice, and the quiet endurance it takes to earn a second chance. Leave a comment below. How many times would you have called her name before you gave up hope?